Our final speaker for today is Peter Baumann. He's a professor at Swarthmore College. He works especially on analytical philosophy, epistemology, ethics, and the topic of his talk is Enlightenment as Perfection, Perfection as Enlightenment, Kantian thinking for oneself, and perfecting oneself. So, Peter, we are ready to listen to you.
Thank you very much. So Kant's views about the nature and the value of enlightenment has been so much discussed since 1784 without ever losing any of its importance and relevance that one might very well feel reluctant to quote the well-known first paragraph again. There's been something like a numbness with certain products of culture, like Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Who can still listen to that? Can we really still read Kant's first paragraph while still being enlightened? Yeah, well, perhaps it's not quite as bad as Vivaldi's case, but I won't quote it here. You all know it. So I will try to minimize the danger of numbness. Perhaps I can make you numb in other ways. We'll see. Now, I'm interested here in a topic that has not found that much attention, some attention, but not quite that much, namely the relation between the idea of enlightenment and the idea of perfection, Vollkommenheit. So the question is whether the project of enlightenment, I'm borrowing a kind of a phrase from Habermas' project of modernity, whether that project is also a project of perfection and vice versa. And if yes, to what degree? So I want to first sketch Kant's views, and if I'm fast enough, then I will add some remarks at the end about the problems that I have with the very idea of perfection. All this, of course, is, I think, directly relevant also to ideas about education. We want people to be enlightened and perhaps in some sense, though I have qualms about that, also be more perfect. Okay, let's take the first step, the idea of enlightenment, of thinking for oneself. The famous slogan, Sapere Aude, is a bit misleading if you translate it as having the courage to be wise or to acquire knowledge. Well, Kant also talks about the use of one's understanding, Verstand, and if one takes this as a faculty, just as a faculty of acquiring knowledge, then one is missing the breadth of the whole project. It's not just about knowledge, it's about thinking for oneself in general, whether it's about matters of fact, about which one can acquire knowledge, according to Kant, or about other matters about which one, according to Kant, cannot, in the strict sense, acquire knowledge, like ethical questions, moral questions, aesthetic questions, and so on. So one can see this in Kant's example in the Enlightenment essay of having one's own moral conscience, or in the mention of the arts in that same article. So, and since pure theoretical reason, practical reason, and judgment cover all of reason, and there's a unity according to Kant, we can be confident that Kant wanted to have the broadest possible scope also for the topics of self-thinking. Now, a couple of remarks on what that could mean. One is about knowledge, about knowledge in particular. So it is conceivable that someone could think for themselves, and because of that, not quite acquire that much knowledge or even lose knowledge that they had before. And it can also happen that you don't really think that much for yourself, and for that reason, you acquire or keep knowledge. So I think the history of quantum mechanics gives nice examples here. So Einstein certainly was someone who thought for himself, even against the rest of the world on certain questions. But it might have been that Bohr was right and that quantum mechanics was complete. So he was thinking, and if that's correct, then we have to say, well, because he was thinking for himself, he got it wrong. And then we have a conflict of values there. Similarly, many people really followed Niels Bohr. He had such authoritarian influence on physicists, it seems, from the little I know about the history after that, that many people just took his word for it without thinking much about it. They thought, that certain things have been proved somewhere, and they don't have to check it. If Bohr and others were right, then they acquired knowledge this way, but only because they were not thinking in a certain way like Einstein for themselves. So the two can diverge. The chances of getting to the truth and thinking for oneself might separate, but I think in the long run, in the big picture, typically you have a better chance of getting at the truth if you think for yourself than otherwise. And I think Kant would agree to that. So epistemic autonomy still has not a 100% connection with the truth, but a good enough connection with the truth so that one might even choose the maxim to think for oneself, and that would be a good thing. And Kant wanted to extend this claim. So there are different standards of correctness for cognition about matters of fact, for erkenntnis. There are other standards of correctness for moral thinking, and then there are standards of correctness for aesthetic considerations. And in all these different respects, thinking for oneself typically also, not always, but typically raises your chances of meeting the standards of correctness. And all this, of course, has to be guided by reason. Now, what could this mean? First, our thinking about all these different matters has to be guided by the standards for the proper use of our faculties, of our rational faculties. This is getting a bit more complicated and a bit more interesting if one puts this in terms, more specifically in terms of requirements of rationality. What exactly makes some piece of reasoning rational and some other piece of reasoning less rational or even irrational? I think the explosion of rationality studies in the last 50, 60, 70 years has made this question very pressing for a Kantian who wants to be up to date, and also very interesting. So I just flagged this up. I'm not going into his. I'm sure Thomas can say a lot about this. There is another aspect, and I don't want to spend too much time about this, but I think I've been thinking for some time now that Kant should have said a bit more about moral thinking. I'm always fascinated by the complexities of applying my prime version of the categorical imperative, that you only should choose and act on maxims that you can consistently want to be shared by anyone else without thereby making your maxim lose its point. So Kant thought, in order to apply moral principles, you don't have to think much about that. But I think you have to actually think a lot in some cases. Take Kant's idea that one shouldn't ever lie. I think the derivation of that specific duty from the general version of the categorical imperative, or one of the general versions, is going to be very tricky, to say the least. So is it really true that my maxim to say, if my maxim is I lie whenever I think it's to my advantage to lie, is that really a maxim that will lose its point if everyone adopts that maxim? So that depends on how often I have occasion to lie or to think that it would be in my advantage. And you know, what would happen if everyone adopted the maxim, or nearly everyone adopted the maxim? That depends on empirical facts about the kind of society I live in, or the kind of people I hang out with. And also there are semantic questions. I mean, what happens if everyone is always lying? Well, perhaps the language just changes. English just changes into negative English, and it's raining just means it turns into meaning it's not raining, and so on. So there are lots of questions to address here, and I think we are pushed even to the limits of applicability of general moral principle here. Consequentialism isn't much better off here. They also have huge problems of applying the general principle in, to cases. Now, the irony that I see here in the case of moral thinking is that I would say there is much more to moral reasoning than Kant thought. Kant thought you don't have to be a philosopher, you don't have to theorize. Your conscience will guide you. Perhaps he had a conception of implicit knowledge. You can't explicate it, but it's somewhere implicit. But it's not that clear. One would have to add something, and I think that would be a friendly amendment if it is an amendment to what Kant was saying. Now, a third comment on thinking for oneself, and I think David has touched on that yesterday. What about testimony? We are epistemically dependent on others in many issues, and I think I already in the discussion yesterday I already commented on that, so I think I can be shorter here. I mean, in that classical debate between Reid and Hume, between reductionists and anti-reductionists about testimony, Kant again chooses a third way and says, well, in some cases, I'm with Reid when it comes to empirical historical knowledge. In other cases, I'm with Hume. And so one could also say that, interestingly, it's the dependency is more acceptable, I would say, in cases of theoretical reasoning. When it comes to moral thinking, I think there's a strong hesitancy or reluctance amongst many of us to accept anything like moral testimony. I mean, you know, if I ask a colleague, would it be morally okay if I gave a student a grade after cursory reading of their essay, and they would say, yes, that's okay. And then I just go on and do it without further thinking about my duties as a grader, then we would say, I haven't done the right kind of moral deliberation. We can't just rely on moral experts, even though moral expertise or some other kind of dependency is important. We can't just shut down conversation with others. And with aesthetics also, I mean, there are perhaps some people who know more about Caravaggio. There's certainly some people, many people who know more about Caravaggio than I do. So I would ask them, but in the end, there's still room for thinking for myself. Okay, so much about thinking for oneself. I think I've used 13 minutes right now. Is that right? I'm still fine time-wise?
I think no.
Oops.
I think you're fine.
Okay.
You still have, I think, about 15 minutes or maybe more.
Something like that.
Yes,
Oh, okay.
started early, so you have plenty of time. Don't
Yeah,
worry.
yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. So on to the second part of this. What is the relation between enlightenment, thinking for yourself, for oneself, and perfection? If one looks at Kant's writings starting in the pre-critical period with his optimism essay and other things, one cannot help but just being stunned by the variety of notions of perfection that come up in his work. And until the religion paper, I won't go through this. This will just be, even for me, as I end the paragraph, I will already have forgotten what I said at the beginning. What is important, I think, is to be aware that when it comes to the relation between enlightenment and perfection, it's really the metaphysic der Sitten, the metaphysics of morals, that gives us by far the most clues about the relation between perfection and enlightenment. In that work, Kant presents two ends that are also duties. Apart from the happiness of others, it's one's own perfection, self-perfection. Humans have a duty to strive after their own perfection. This is understood as the cultivation of one's theoretical as well as practical talents. There is the duty to leave the state of ignorance, correct one's errors, and acquire knowledge. There is not only the duty to cultivate the intellect, but also the will to get into a state where one does one's duty because it is one's duty. One thus has a duty to turn oneself into someone who does one's duty out of a sense of duty. An interesting iteration of duties here that I don't see in earlier writings of Kant. Kant also specifically mentions the intellectual, psychological, and physical abilities, Geistes-, Seelen- und Leibeskräfte. The first contain Wissenschaft, the second memory and imagination, which also help with the aesthetic sensibility. Through the cultivation of one's talents, one becomes generally apt and useful for the attainment of all kinds of ends. This is our duty. This way we are useful, quote, to the world. Kant then points out that the duty to perfect oneself is an imperfect duty. It remains open how far one should go with the cultivation of which talents and in which proportion the different talents should be cultivated. Of particular interest is also Kant's sense for human limits. Because of that, because of our fragility, Gebrechlichkeit, it cannot be our duty to attain perfection. Ought implies can, after all. It can only be our duty to strive after perfection, to make continuous progress towards it. The limits of possible human cognition, knowledge, Erkenntnis, which Kant described so wonderfully in the Critique of Pure Reason, are another reason to support the idea of principal limits to possible human perfection. And one could also add here the limits that having to do with epistemic dependency on others. Now, Kant's point about being useful to humanity is astonishingly utilitarian, or sounds astonishingly utilitarian for him. But I think this is not his main point. Much more important and crucial here, and crucial to him, are the above-mentioned theoretical and practical perfections. Why should one think we have such a duty to perfect ourselves? Where does that duty come from? Kant describes the process of cultivation quite drastically as the move from animal to human. He points out repeatedly that we have to be worthy of humanity, to further the ends and the worth of humanity in our own person, and to thus show respect for humanity. All this is certainly open to more than one interpretation and invites many requests for clarification and support by reasons. In the groundwork, the cultivation of one's talents was more closely related to the categorical imperative. Perhaps the means-end version is the most promising version of the categorical imperative here. But still, the question remains whether, and if yes, why we should cultivate our different talents. The more normative basis for the idea of human perfection, I think, remains an interesting construction site for the contemporary Kantian. I mean, there are Kant scholars and there are people who want to use Kant for today's purposes, and both go hand in hand and sing similar songs together, I hope. Now, I don't want to go more into detail here. What I want to point to, and that's the main point of this paper, is the convergence of the two projects, enlightenment and perfection. The cultivation of our theoretical as well as practical abilities is common to both. And you can even find a remark in the Opus Posthumum where he explicitly states that. Furthermore, human dignity and the dignity of humanity is mentioned as a reason both for enlightenment and for perfection. Should we then conclude that enlightenment and perfection are two different sides of one and the same project? Or should we rather say that for Kant, talk about enlightenment and talk about perfection refer to the same project? Now, I think a lot speaks for a view like that, even though Kant, interestingly, doesn't seem to say much at all about the relation between enlightenment and perfection. I think what one can say is that Kant goes into more detail and tries to offer more reasons and arguments when he's talking about his views on perfection than when he's presenting his views on enlightenment. Another difference has to do with the fact that the basic formal attitude of rational autonomy, thinking rationally for oneself, is more in the foreground when he talks about enlightenment than when he talks about perfection. When he talks about perfection, the specific dimensions in which humans are expected to make progress are more in the foreground. But it seems to me that neither of these two things can be fully understood if we want to understand Kant without the other. So I think there is one complex project with different parts for Kant, and the different parts are treated from different perspectives. So enlightenment is not the same thing as perfection. Perfection is not the same thing as enlightenment, but they are very closely related to each other, and one cannot have one without the other. So I should say again, this is the view that you get when you really put the metaphysics of morals at the center of the thoughts about the relation between enlightenment and perfection. So I want to end with a third section on a more systematic topic, namely, should we say hooray to perfection? Is the idea of perfection a good idea? And if not, what does that mean for what we want to do with Kant? Now, Kant thinks that we can't attain perfection, but we could strive after it. It's perhaps a kind of a regulative ideal. But even when you have a regulative ideal, the ideal should still make sense. And I think perfection taken in a certain straightforward way doesn't make much sense, or is a bad idea, or not well supported idea. The sense in which I take perfection here is the idea of maximal goodness. Goodness such that you couldn't be better than that. Now I want to distinguish between three different kinds of perfection. Specific perfection, the first one, perfection in one specific respect. I mean, a particular hammer might perhaps be perfect for the task of putting nails into walls, but not perfect for cutting my fingernails. So it's perfect in one particular respect. Or someone might be considered a perfect cook without being perfect at training dogs. Then there is second, universal perfection, the aggregation of all the different special perfections. I think that there are problems with that because aggregation is typically an issue whenever you aggregate something, also because the different perfections might not be compatible with each other. And then finally, there's absolute perfection, the ens perfectissimum that you find, for instance, in Descartes' fifth meditation. Perfection not in any respect, not non-relativized absolute perfections. I find really hard to make much sense of it, but it plays a big role in the pre-critical Kant in his optimism essay and elsewhere. But I think later you don't find that much. You find comments on it, of course, in Critique of Pure Reason, but he's not a fan anymore of this. So I think the first one is relevant, specific perfection. So can there be such a thing as maximal goodness with respect to one thing, one task, one kind of performance? Why should we assume that? We've learned that there is no greatest prime number. For any given prime number, there is one that is bigger. An old proof, beautiful proof. So why should we think that perfection maximizes out, has an upper bound? Related to that, we need an argument for that, right? I'm not saying that there isn't, but as long as there is no argument presented, I have reason to be skeptical. Even if there is an upper bound, we need to make sure that we are not just converging, but never towards the upper bound, but never reaching it. If we are merely converging, then for any state that we reach, however close we get to the upper bound, there is another one that's even closer. It's like real numbers on a line, approaching one. You still have another a real number between the one you chose and one. And with respect to, complete knowledge about everything, we have in addition a threat of an infinite regress. An omniscient being would have to also know that they know everything, and they would have to know that they know everything, and all the way through the infinite regress. So these are first kind of doubts about the very idea of maximal goodness. Another, perhaps less academic worry, or a worry that's closer to practical concerns in real life, is that perfecting one talent often is incompatible with perfecting another talent. So I might have reason to being good as a cook, but not quite so good that I turn into a nasty jerk and my social abilities go down the drain, and I can't do anything else anymore. I remember with respect to knowledge that some of us are here who had Günther Patzig still as a professor. He used to talk about T knowledge, the letter T, where the vertical stroke represented breadth and expertise, and the horizontal stroke, the vertical stroke represented depth and expertise, and the horizontal one, breadth. And that always appealed to me, except that I would also propose pi knowledge, where you have perhaps two vertical strokes and one horizontal one. So what this all suggests is that the good idea is rather an optimum, or not perfection in even one respect, but a good balance of pretty good attainments or pretty good capabilities in several different dimensions. The space of perfection is multi-dimensional. It's not one-dimensional. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Do we lose anything important if we say, I don't want to be perfect, I just want to be good enough? I don't think we lose, and I think we win something. If one thinks about the phenomenology of seriously working on some project, whether it's an art project, writing an essay, trying to find an answer to a difficult question, what captures us is just the task. And we're struggling with the task. And the idea is this perfect is somehow irrelevant. If you think of Beethoven, I mean, he struggled with everything he composed, but he wanted to do it a certain way. He wanted to do something, and he was not, I wish we could bring him back for more than one reason, but one could ask him, was it that you strive for perfection? And he would say, my bet is he would say, damn not. It was so hard. I wanted to find a good fourth movement for the Ninth Symphony. Damn. Forget about perfection. I think Beethoven would say that. I think Beethoven would agree with me. Well, I don't take that too seriously. So perhaps it's even a bad idea. Perhaps we have an obligation not to strive after maximal goodness. Recently, there's been a lot of debates on human enhancements. This is a rising topic, given the technology that is appearing at the horizon and getting closer and closer. People are talking about designer children. And I think there are very serious reasons to resist that. Also Kantian reasons, I think, to resist that. And I'm not only thinking of Kant here, but also of Yogi Berra, who once said, if life were perfect, it wouldn't be. If life were perfect, it wouldn't be. So I come to the end. I think even though that Kant seems to have adhered to the regulative idea of maximizing goodness or perfection, I think there is a way of reading him more charitably or suggesting to him a different idea. So I'm trying hard here to make peace between, or to suggest to Kant and the Kantians and the Kant scholars here in the room, the idea that it would still be Kant enough or Kantian enough to say that we should strive after being good enough and pretty good in all the relevant respects. That's a more modest notion that leads us to a more modest notion of enlightenment and perfection, perhaps a satisfying and not a maximizing notion of enlightenment and perfection. It's not that the modesty takes any of the radicalness and depth out of the project of enlightenment. I think it actually gives it more bite if we go from maximization to satisfying. And so I think that would be a better idea. And I'm not quite sure whether Kant would like that, but I think for the Kantian, that would be a very good perspective. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thanks. Very interesting. And actually, I think that your view in the end is much more Kantian than you make it out to be, because so when you said that you're reading the Enlightenment through the metaphysics of morals, I think what you meant was you're reading it through the doctrine of virtue.
Yes.
If you look at the doctrine of right, what you get is absolute prohibitions, things you may never do, even if they would serve self-perfection, right? In a way, these absolute prohibitions are much more Kantian duties in nature than these ends that you have to further, right? So even if Kant thought that self-perfection is great, we should work towards it, it has to be within narrow confines, or at least within the confines of perfect duty, right? And in that sense, he's not a perfectionist. No matter how much perfection you get out of lying to people, if that happened, you're not allowed to do it. So I think in a way he takes this Enlightenment idea of perfection that you find in Wolf and others and puts it, but it's almost dialectical, right? Where he says that they're onto something, you know, we need to sublate this, we need to preserve it in a way, but we have to put it in its rightful context where it's constrained and just one aspect of what we owe. And there are other aspects, much more important ones. So in that sense, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, and just what Kant needs to maintain. I guess the only thing is that what might be interesting is to wonder, within the confines of perfect duty and anything else, do we have to maximize self-perfection within these constraints, or should we be maximized even if it's clear that we may never violate perfect duties? That seems not so clear. Kant might have said we should perfect as much as we can, as long as we don't violate other more important duties.
Yes, yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's a good point. Of course, when you say I got it mostly right, I can't disagree with you here, unfortunately. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it makes a big difference whether you're talking about perfect and imperfect duties. And that's right. That's a good point. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter, for invoking the Göttingen of the early 90s. I felt rejuvenated by 30 years at one stroke, which is very nice. But I've got a question about your skepticism with regard to perfection that you mentioned towards the end of the paper. I've got other questions as well, but I bracket those. Does that depend on our finitude? I mean, it sounds a lot like it, right? But if you take the dialectic of the second critique and the doctrine of method of the first critique and all that kind of stuff seriously, and you may well not do. Of course, we've got infinite time to perfect ourselves. So would that change your view? Do you think that if we had all the time in the world and even beyond it, we should, in fact, pursue self-perfection?
Yeah, thank you. No, I don't think that would change much. You know, infinity is always tricky, all right? So if we had infinite time, we can fail. I mean, you can have infinite time to roll for getting a 6 in a roll of dice, and it's perfectly possible that you will never get it, right, in infinite time. But I think that one limit to it has nothing to do with us, but rather with the very idea of a maximum. It's more like the numbers, the natural numbers have no upper limit. And one would have to, you know, I don't have a proof that goodness doesn't have a maximum, but I'm a bit more Pyrrhonian here. I say, look, I won't subscribe to that. We have no reason to subscribe to that idea as long as there isn't an argument that goodness is like that. I think I tend to think, perhaps I had a hunch in the other direction. I think goodness is rather like the Richter scale for earthquakes. It's open, upwards open. And so I think that's a metaphysical worry that I have. And that's interesting for if you think about God. Could God be maximally good? And according to what I am saying about the problems of a maximum, one would have to say not even God could be maximally good, and not even Satan could be maximally evil. You could do even better. For any God, you have another God that would be better. For any Satan, you would have one that is even worse. I haven't thought about the implications for philosophical theology there, but that's a footnote.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I would be quite problematic for some proofs that the existence of God if they worked, right? And they don't.
Yeah, but they don't. Yes.
Thank you. Andrei?
My question is, why not to limit Kant's concept of enlightenment to conditions necessary for perfection? Because as I understand this merely in political sense, how I understand this concept of enlightenment. So it's less than education even, and imperfection, but imperfection in broad sense. Of course, we need some perfection even to realize enlightenment, okay, but as remembering also previous question, I also consider how to understand perfection. Maybe it's the question how it's understood in Kant's metaphysics of morals, namely as a finalized state or as a process. I mean, it would be a process of perfection in our in following our duties, because it needs our whole life to repeat it again and again. Or yes, perfection as a result of education, of cultivation, of developing of our predispositions in more historical sense. Maybe it would be another.
Oh, that's very interesting. I mean, there were many things in what you were saying, and I got hooked right with the first thing you said. Why not, if I understood you correctly, see enlightenment as a proper part of perfection? Or one could say, why not the other way around? And I think that's a very interesting idea. Now, at the end of the part of that part of my paper, I think there are aspects of perfection that don't quite fit what he's saying about enlightenment. So physical education, right? It's hard to subsume perfection under enlightenment. So that direction would, but you propose the other direction. And I think what he's saying, that's the more interesting one, actually. I think it's so closely connected to rational autonomy, and that is so important to Kant, that I would still want to say it's not just a sub-project or proper part of perfection. It's a thing of its own. And for the contemporary Kantian who wants to take some things from Kant and leave others, I think it's easier to say, look, for Kant, they hang very closely together, but perhaps we don't want to have the connection quite that close. And so I see your point. I think it's a good point, but I would, for these reasons, still rather want to see the overall project as comprising two siblings, perhaps even identical twin projects. Yes, hope that makes sense. But it's a good point. Thank you.
I have a question about perfection and thinking for yourself. And my question assumes nothing about Kant. So it seems to me that one reason to not just admit the possibility of imperfection, but to actually embrace imperfection, is that it allows you the possibility of minimizing imperfection. So let me give you a couple examples. One easy example is, if we have to predict whether Becky Hammond is going to make her next free throw, and she's a 90% free throw shooter, if you're shooting for perfection, you're going to guess that she's going to make 90%, and you're going to try and guess when she misses those 10%. But of course, you will guess more accurately if you just always say she's going to make her free throw. Second, more important sort of example that I have run into very recently, talking to some members of my family who are who don't want to get the COVID vaccine, is we talk about they talk about thinking for themselves a lot, and they wonder why I don't. And so, and I say, well, I trust the CDC, and they point out, and if you trust science, and and you're at all sophisticated about the history of science or sophisticated about the recent history of the CDC, you'll know they make mistakes. And so deferring in that particular situation, not thinking for yourself, is guaranteeing that you're going to make errors, and you're going to guarantee that you make errors when people who are thinking for themselves don't make an error. And that can be a particularly painful kind of error. And yet, it seems to me that it's epistemically wise to nonetheless defer, recognizing that is imperfect and actually embracing that kind of imperfection. That's related to some other things you talked about with respect to the maxim and being on, whether you should adopt the maxim, it's okay to lie sometimes. And that's going to depend on your social situation and the social institutions that you're embedded in. It seems to me that this is exactly the same sort of thing. When you should defer and when you should defer and admit the possibility of imperfection. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm not sure I'm disagreeing with you, but it seems to me that the one place where I might want to press you a little bit is on the good thing you said very briefly about thinking for yourself.
Yes, okay, thank you. There were several good points there. The first one, by embracing imperfection, you minimize it. I think that's correct. I mean, you can be overly confident, and that raises the chances that you won't perform quite that well. You can also be this is perhaps an Aristotelian point about the mean, right? You can overly self-critical, and that will guarantee, in some cases, failure. There's also something to be said in favor of humility, epistemic and otherwise. It makes us better persons in some sense if we not just recognize our imperfections, even if we are pretty good, if we have that false belief to some degree that we are not quite that good. We shouldn't be bragging with modesty, but there is something to that. I haven't thought that through. I'm being modest here, do you know? I haven't thought that through, but I think this is an interesting project on its own. Now, the anti-vaxxers, I think that's a complicated case. I doubt that those people have epistemic reasons to doubt, to trust in science. I think other things are going on. Perhaps they think the kind of person I am is not the kind of person that is a spoiled, bubbly, sipping, frivolous, academic, snobbish, liberal. I'm not that kind of person. So I won't do any of the things they do, right? There's a lot. You're either a beer or wine person in the US. And if you drink wine in this country, then you already feel you're a traitor to the real people, so something like that is going on. But the more serious point is you're absolutely right. There can be cases where trusting science, and there have been cases, leads you into error, and even foolishly distrusting science gets you the right results. I mean, I just the other day remembered that some years ago, at least in Germany, people warned against using butter, and they said, use margarine. That's much more healthy. And then I think the opinion has turned around. And had I been an anti-margarine person, because only the fancy, snobbish people do that, I would have been on the right side of things. The real point is, in the long run, when you consider lots of cases, when you think about adopting a maxim for many cases, then you should trust science. That's the best maxim that we have. And there is no perfection there. Of course, science is getting things wrong, but the alternatives are so much worse in the long run. I mean, if someone says, has an improbable hunch, they got it from reading the tea leaves, and they turned out to be right against all the odds, right? Then we would say you're just lucky. But that is not a recommendation for policy, right? Especially when much is at stake. I hope I covered more or less what you were saying. But yeah, thank you. This is I take this as a friendly amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thomas?
This is perhaps a tiny point. At one point in your talk, you said, or you asked rather, whether enlightenment and perfection are not just two sides of the same coin. And maybe I was too tired at the moment to follow your reflection there for a moment, but I was wondering, or I was getting distracted actually by my own thought immediately when you raised that question. Because one of the things you can do with these concepts is always ask yourself whether these are process or product concepts. And you can construct both of them as either process and product concepts. But I think that in the Kantian case, at least, it seems pretty clear that enlightenment is described by him as a process concept and not a product concept, because at the end of the essay, of course, he asks whether we live in an enlightened age and says no, but in an age of enlightenment. This is a continuous process. Perfection, however, doesn't seem to be a process concept at all, right? It seems to be a product concept and has the same frailties that, for instance, the concept of happiness has in Kant's ethical works, right? So wouldn't that be a rather easy way to
okay.
answer the question?
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, we also talk about, I'm not quite sure. My hunch at the moment is that both have both aspects, perhaps to different degrees. So we talk about, we tell people, why don't you try to perfect yourself or to become better? And then we think of a process. And we are also already happy when they're trying hard and getting better. And we would say, yeah, you're in the process, even though you haven't reached quite the end state yet. So perfection has both sides, and I think enlightenment too.
Not perfection. I mean, you deliberately went into the verb here to perfect yourself, improve yourself.
Yeah.
That's a process thing. But the notion of perfection as an end state, product.
Yeah. Okay. So is that a deep point about? This is not a rhetorical question about the nature of perfection and enlightenment, or is it rather a grammatical point about the difference between the verb and the noun?
Ideally, out of a grammatical point, a deep point might emerge.
Well, sometimes not, unfortunately.
Things happen.
But
we are very optimistic about what language and
but I think, you know, I think this is, I like to take that on. And I think even if you say, look, there is more of the sense of a product in the one and more of the sense of a process in the other. That would be grist for my final mill of saying they're not the same, but they are very closely. So I think this is good. Yeah, noted. Thank you.
Peter, I wanted to try whether I can take away some perplexity about Kant's emphasis on perfection by highlighting that I think none of the duties of perfection are, so to say, self-standing, and they are all related to that which is the most fundamental duty for perfection, which is the perfection of virtue. And if we see the perfection of our talents as subsumed under the duty to perfect virtue, it becomes trivial to think of the perfection of virtue to be a duty, because, as Kant says, in matters of virtue, there we see the perfection or regress.
Mm-hmm.
Because to exercise virtue is to, in any case in which I exercise virtue, and that is,
mm-hmm.
Virtue is called for at any moment in my life, I make a victory over my self-love. So to say, it's a success. I always said no to my self-love. So and therefore, any exercise is a strengthening of my will, and there, in that sense, a perfection of my virtue. Hence, not to perfect virtue means to decide not to exercise it, but not to exercise virtue is to be evil.
Oh, okay.
So either there's perfection or regress, and so
Okay.
that's, I think, I think so. We should see the duty of perfection more as depending on that fundamental thought to perfect one's virtue, and on virtue there we see the perfection or regress.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think there were several points, if I understood you correctly. So I wouldn't want to read Kant as subsuming the idea of perfection of one's talent under the idea of perfecting one's virtuousness. I think he's surprisingly Wittgensteinian in the sense that he has a very heterogeneous view of the different talents, this, that, and the other. That's not so typical of Kant, that he's giving up on systematicity every now and then, but it makes him even more sympathetic to me. On the other point that I wanted to comment upon, one thing I didn't mention here is there is a real question, for instance, brought up by Susan Wolf in her article on saints, where she says moral perfection or perfection of virtues is a bad idea because there are other good things in life. And you might say, if you're not a Kantian, then you're just failing to be a good person. But I think that raises big questions about the nature. I mean, Susan Wolf is following Williams here, really Bernard Williams again. I'm not a big friend of Bernard Williams' view on ethics, but I recognize that there really is a question sometimes of whether we have a good reason to put virtue aside a bit because something else is more important. I mean, one illustration of that makes me think again and again is thinking of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. If you have the choice of inviting Alyosha over to dinner or Ivan and Smerdyakov, everyone would want the latter. Alyosha is boring. He's the good guy. He's the angel, but I don't want to have dinner with angels. And even if I would make me better, there's other, I mean, this is a bit hard. I mean, take it with a grain or 2 grains of salt, but there is something serious in that. And I think this is a really substantial question that is still, for me at least, still somewhat open, though I so sympathize with the Kantian view that moral reasons trump all other reasons. But as I'm getting older and older, I'm more and more sympathetic to the view that perhaps almost always morality trumps everything else, but not quite always. This is a very imperfect answer to a big Williams-like, Wolf-like question, but if anyone else can give a better answer, I would love to hear it. I think David has the answer.
Yeah, so first thing I said was that I don't have the answer to this. But I was going to ask whether we can, whether it can be coherent, whether we can make sense of the idea of acting under an ideal of perfection in some sense, even if the idea of the perfect is of dubious coherence. So, so the Beethoven example was kind of neat. Definitely someone one might want at your dinner party. I mean, so you represented Beethoven as saying, well, you know, perfection, of course, I'm not striving for that. And it's true that to strive to write a symphony better than which no symphony could be looks, I mean, the idea of the symphony better than which no symphony could be looks incoherent, or but still there's a sense in which one has to strive and not settle for something that we somehow admit to be improvable in a sense, right? So I mean, it's very hard to get this right, but
I think I get it.
Yeah, that you can, you know, good enough. So the sufficientarian approach doesn't seem to sit well with Beethoven. Like, okay, the sonata's good enough. I mean, that seems to be the wrong thought, although it's, I mean, that pragmatic thought no doubt occurred many times to Beethoven and others in the sense of getting something ready for performance, you know, getting it done. Like as you tell your grad students, like it's just got to be good enough, finish the darn thing. But still the ideal has to not acquiesce in that kind of allowing it to be weaker than it could be, even though being as good as being so good that it couldn't be better is not a coherent thing to aim at. Okay.
Good. Thank you. These are very good points. So first, a quick one. Suppose Beethoven came back and would, of course, listen to what has happened in the meantime, listen to the music. We could ask him, what do you like? How do you like Schoenberg? And all that. But if we asked him, so would you like to revise the Third Symphony? Or any of his, that would be a silly question. I think that's right. I will go back. I mean, this relates with the third point, so I jump over the second and go back to that later. Sure, there is a difference between lazy contentment. Oh yeah, I could do better, but hey, for this purpose, I can get away with this. That's lazy because you have good reason to spend more time with your project. And when you're saying, oh yeah, that's good enough, let's go out for drinks, you're not being honest, you're being insincere in that you're not happy. You're not really happy with you're somewhat happy, you're somewhat content, but that's not really what you wanted out of the project. So there is a difference between the lazy good enough and the good enough. I imagine, you know, going back to Beethoven, who would say, sure, perhaps if I had a second run, perhaps I would do some things a bit different, but I am unreservedly happy with letting it go into the world. And the question whether it could be even better is not a live question for me. Whereas in the lazy case, that's a live question. I mean, one has to be more precise here. There's more to say. I will think more about this. What makes the lazy good enough different from the well-justified good enough? But I think that, you know, if you ask a painter, art is so good here, or why is art such a good example? I also don't quite know the answer to that question. But if you take Picasso and you could talk to him and say, so he's finally finished something. If you've seen the movie Picasso, where you see him paint through a transparent canvas, so the painting is not occluded by Picasso himself. It's a fascinating movie, 30, 40 years old. And you see how he changes plans. And he says, do I still have time? Yeah, 90 seconds. And he changes everything. And you think, goodness, how can you finish? And he does it, and he pulls it off. And 5 minutes before time is up, he has completed it in a certain sense. And he's not saying, oh, well, that should be good enough for you idiots who don't understand my art or something. So, but to spell it out is a great project. Finally, formally second point that I pick up from what you said, there is something somewhat more paradoxical about saying, I strive after X, though I know that X is a crazy idea. And being in a more paradoxical predicament is a problem. And I think it's even not, it's irrational to, I mean, there's some irrationality in saying it's raining, but I don't believe it. And similarly, it's something irrational in saying I want a Philly cheesesteak, though I know there's nothing that speaks in favor of having a Philly cheesesteak. And similarly, I strive after being the softest grader in my institution, though that is really an evil aim. So the more paradoxality would raise problems for the question, which has also occupied me a bit, whether one couldn't take something as a regulative ideal, even if one has at least doubts about the intelligibility of that ideal. But all this is food for thought. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you. And
Thanks.
Leonid is the last one. Try to be brief.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, maybe you have already said something on this topic. As I correctly understood, you look skeptically at the idea of perfection. And my question is on the role of education in the process of perfection. Could you comment two famous claims from the lectures on pedagogy of Kant? Education carries the potential for the improvement of the human race. Behind education lies the great secret of the perfection of human nature. Mm-hmm. And second, for Kant, human beings have been created for good and must be educated for good. And so the task of education and its hope is that the human race will move closer to perfection from generation to generation. Do you agree with Kant that the human race moves or is moving closer to perfection from generation to generation?
Oh, wow.
Can we observe progress from generation to generation? Now, is the idea of perfection suitable for education?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I mean, what he's saying about moving closer and improving is compatible with a non-maximizing conception. And I like that. But the toughest question that you ask is, are we really getting closer or further away? Are there kinds of perfection that are morally dubious or harmful? Could knowing more, right, be a bad thing? Right? I think Kant is an optimist in the sense that he thinks, no, that can't happen. Knowing more cannot create a conflict with other aims that we have, with, say, moral ideals that we have. But I think there are cases where this makes the whole thing a bit complicated. There are cases where we have reason not to know. certain things. I mean, there is the morality of privacy, to take a very pedestrian example. I have reasons not to know. Sometimes we have reasons to lie to people. I think against Kant, I think Kant should agree with that. I think he's misapplying the categorical imperative when it comes to lying. Perhaps Jens will jump back in. I don't know. So that's a very big question. And I think when we think about specific cases, there certainly are possible conflicts. And there's certainly, it would be good in one way to have this knowledge that can happen, but we shouldn't have it because it would be bad in those ways, and those ways override these ways. But, you know, when you think about things like that, you will take conflict of values more seriously, not just prima facie conflicts of values, but other overall, all things considered, conflicts of values much more seriously than Kant ever did. I think Kant was still with Aristotle and others. Well, there's some disagreement amongst scholars whether Aristotle really believed in the unity of virtues, but you can have all of them and all to a similar degree, I think. But I think the standard view of all these people is that they don't see much of a problem, that we have to give up here, something here, in order to get something more, a bit more important there. But that's a big question. Thank you. And I have, perhaps I only have half answers. In specific cases, yes. It's not clear to me what the overall big picture about the relation between the different values in general is. Thank you.